The night they cast me out, the sky looked like a wound, bruised purple at the edges, angry and low, with clouds pressing down over the Ironhide settlement as though the heavens themselves were leaning in to watch. But I wasn't looking at the sky. I was looking at the veil. The Bloodfang Pack calls the Veil of Eloria a divine miracle. They boast of it during every feast, their voices roaring with pride through the high stone halls of our palace. To them, the veil is a shimmering shield of salvation, a gift from the gods that keeps the Shadowmoon clan at bay. They are wrong. I look at that translucent barrier wrapping around our kingdom, and I don't see salvation. I see my own reflection in a mirror of stolen time. It hums through my veins, a cruel, insistent vibration that matches the rhythm of my own heart. The veil is no miracle. It is a parasite, and I am its host. I am 21 years old. I have lived within these walls for every second of my memory, and yet I have never truly walked among my people. I was born to King Alpharon, but I was never his daughter. I was a mistake, an Omega born without a wolf, a stain on the Ironhide legacy. Maristra. It was the only thing my mother left me, a name that meant Star of the Sea. But in this pack of wolves, I was nothing but a drowning girl. My mother, Yesera, was the only one who saw me. She saw the light I was forced to carry. Before she died, she pulled me close, her hands trembling as she touched the pale, silver-white glow that leaked from my fingertips. "Promise me," she whispered, her eyes darting to the seer standing like a shadow in the corner. "Promise me you will never speak of the hum in your blood. Never tell the king that the earth breathes only because you do. The tether will consume you, Maristra. If they know what you are, they will not protect you. They will harvest you." I kept that promise. I kept it for 21 years while my father looked through me as if I were made of glass. I kept it while the pack discarded me, a useless, hollow thing. Tonight, the tether pulls harder than ever. My vision blurs at the edges. The colors of the room leach into gray. I reach for the feeling of the cold stone under my hands, but the sensation is distant, like touching the world through a thick layer of ice. I am losing the ability to feel, replaced by the insatiable hunger of the barrier. I feel a crack in the veil. It's not a sound, but a jagged, tearing sensation in my chest. Something is coming. The Shadowmoon clan is closer than they have ever been, and the veil, my skin, my blood, my life, is shivering under the impact. I am holding the line, but I am hollowed out. I am a ghost in my own home, burning myself to ash to protect those who wouldn't even mourn if I stopped breathing. My father walks the halls just floors above me, unaware that his kingdom's survival is tied to the heart of the daughter he is about to discard. He thinks he is protected by the gods. He has no idea he is being saved by a girl he left to die. Tonight, the world will change. I wonder, as the light drains from my hands into the dark, if they will ever realize that the miracle they worship is the woman they threw away. The courtyard was a sea of faces I had known my entire life, and yet I had never felt more like a stranger. The torches were lit in 2 long, jagged rows, their flames thrashing against the wind. The rain had just begun, thin, freezing needles that bit into my skin. I stood in the center of the circle they had made for me. They didn't stand back out of respect. They stood back because I was tainted. I was the Omega who carried no wolf. I was the defect in a lineage of warriors. I kept my hands loose at my sides. I had decided as I walked down the stone steps of the palace that I would not fold them. I would not hug myself for warmth. I would not give them the satisfaction of watching me try to hold myself together. I have served this pack in the shadows. I have bled for them in ways they will never comprehend. I have shown love to every single one of them. And tonight, they gathered in their hundreds to tell me I was not enough. King Alpharon, my father, stood on the dais. Beside him, the air was heavy with the scent of power, dominant, suffocating, and cruel. "Maristra," he said. His voice didn't echo, it commanded. "The elders have reached a decision. You are a drain on our resources, a phantom in our ranks. By the time the moon hits the meridian, you are to be beyond our borders." I didn't flinch. I didn't beg. I had learned a long time ago that my father's heart was just a muscle, not a place where love lived. I lifted my chin, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "What is my offense, father?" I asked, the silence in the courtyard deepening. "What have I done to deserve banishment from you and from this pack?" "You have existed in our shadow," my father snapped, his eyes flashing with a predatory gold. "That is not service. That is charity. And we are done being charitable." "But I am your daughter," I whispered, my voice trembling for the first time. "I am your last bloodline." My father laughed, a cold, jagged sound that had no humor in it. He leaned forward, his gaze dripping with venom. "I would rather have a chicken for a daughter than a mistake of a person like you. Let my bloodline end. If I cannot produce another child, then so be it. You are worthless, wolfless, nothing but a stupid healing omega." He raised his hand, his eyes glowing with the terrifying intensity of the Alpha command. "I hereby sever the bond. By my word and my blood, I cast you out of the Bloodfang Pack. You are no longer ours. You are nothing." A surge of crushing, invisible pressure slammed into my chest, the physical weight of his Alpha command forcing the bond to break. He stood there, chest puffed with pride, believing he was finally cutting a burden loose. He had no idea that in his arrogance, he was cutting the pack's life support. A murmur went through the crowd. It wasn't pity, it was relief. They hated me because I was a constant reminder that their perfect Alpha King had produced a defect. I was the secret they couldn't burn, so they decided to cast me into the dark instead. I turned away from the dais. I didn't look for a sympathetic face, because there weren't any. I walked the long path to the servants' quarters, a small, windowless hole beneath the kitchen stairs. I packed nothing but the leather satchel my mother had left me, her journals, and the small wooden lark she'd carved the day she told me I was meant to fly. When I stepped out of the palace gates, the rain was coming down in sheets. I reached the edge of the veil, the shimmering, translucent boundary that kept the Shadowmoon clan from tearing our throats out. Every wolf in this pack thought the veil was a gift from the gods. They knelt to it, they sang to it. They had no idea it was a parasite. As I walked toward the tree line, I felt the tether in my blood pull taut. It was a physical ache, a searing heat that started in my marrow and radiated outward. The veil wasn't a static wall, it was a living thing, tied to my heartbeat. Every breath I took, every pulse of blood through my veins, fed the energy that kept my father's kingdom safe. My father thought he was casting out a failure. He was actually cutting the main artery of his own survival. I stopped at the very edge of the territory, my hand pressed against the hum of the barrier. It felt like a frantic, dying animal under my palm. If I leave, I thought, the realization hitting me like a physical blow, the veil will collapse. The Shadowmoon clan will be here within days. I looked back at the palace. at the warm, glowing windows where my father was pouring a glass of wine to celebrate his clean bloodline. I should have let it fall. I should have walked away and watched them burn for every cold look, every whispered insult, every night I spent shivering in the dark while they feasted. But I couldn't. I was a healer. It was in my blood, a curse I couldn't outrun. And despite everything, I still loved my people. I knelt in the freezing mud and pressed both hands into the earth. I didn't hold the barrier back. I anchored it. I pulled the last, deepest reserves of my life force, weaving it into the bedrock of the territory. It was a final, desperate stitch in a dying cloth. It would hold for a month, maybe 2, long enough for them to be safe, long enough for them to realize that when I was gone, the blessing went with me. When I pulled my hands away, I was shaking so hard my teeth rattled. The world went gray. My vision tunneled until there was nothing left but the rhythm of the rain hitting the mud. I crawled into the tree line, my breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. I was a ghost, a forgotten girl, a discarded thing. I didn't know where I was going, and for the first time in my life, I didn't have a reason to stay. I closed my eyes and let the forest swallow me whole. The forest was not silent. It was screaming. As I pushed through the tangled briars of the Fenrisar wilderness, the earth beneath my feet felt wrong. For 21 years, the soil had been an extension of my own nervous system. I had felt every root, every shift in the water table, every insect burrowing into the loam. But as I distanced myself from the palace, that connection began to tear. Each step was a physical rupture. Behind me, the veil, that shimmering false miracle, was fraying. I didn't need to turn around to see it. I could feel it in the way the air grew brittle, losing the warmth I had pumped into it for so long. The land back at the Ironhide settlement wasn't just losing its protection, it was entering a deep, necrotic chill. And yet, as the tether weakened, something impossible happened. My own blood, which had felt like liquid lead for years, began to simmer. I felt a surge of raw energy flooding back into my marrow. My lungs, usually heavy with the exhaustion of sustaining a kingdom, felt like they were drinking in oxygen for the first time. I wasn't just walking. I was reclaiming myself, one intoxicating step at a time. But I was running on nothing but a dying heart. The exhaustion hit me like a system failure. My vision snapped shut. I didn't fall so much as I simply ceased to exist, my body collapsing into the damp, decaying leaves of the neutral woods. I woke to the smell of rain, pine, and something sharp, masculine and dangerous. I tried to move, but my limbs felt like iron. "You're a long way from the gilded cage, Maristra." The voice was cool, steady, and terrifyingly familiar. I forced my eyes open. Auric, the future alpha of the Shawl Pack. He stood over me, his dark leathers blending into the shadows, his molten amber eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You're shaking," he noted. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me the way a scholar looks at a forbidden text he's finally cracked open. "That's a lot of power to dump into the dirt just to save a man who hates you." "I didn't do it for him," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was filled with glass. "I did it because I'm not a monster." Auric crouched down, bringing his face inches from mine. "You're not a monster, but you're a liability to every alpha in this territory. You just turned the tide of a war you didn't even know you were fighting." "Why are you here, Auric?" I managed to ask, my fingers curling into the mud. "Did my father send you to finish what he started?" He let out a short, sharp laugh. "Your father is currently celebrating the death of his stain. He's too blind to realize that the moment you left his gates, he turned into a walking corpse." He reached out, brushing a damp lock of hair away from my forehead. The touch was electric. "I've been watching you for years, Maristra," he whispered, his gaze dropping to the light-depleted skin of my palms. "I know of the power you possessed. I watched you bleed yourself dry to keep those wolves safe. I waited for you to snap. I waited for you to finally realize that you were the one holding the leash." "How can I trust you?" I asked, my voice gaining a desperate edge. "A man who knows what no one else knows about me. How you get this information is a mystery I don't care to solve." He smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was a smile that promised secrets would be answered in due time. He offered his hand. This time, I took it. His grip was firm, hot, and impossible to break. As he hauled me to my feet, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I felt a tether snap into place. Not the parasitic draining cord of the veil, but something stronger. Something chosen. I was officially in exile. I was officially empty. But for the first time in my life, I was standing on my own 2 feet. Auric didn't take me to the grand, marble-pillared halls of his father's main palace. Instead, he led me deep into the gray belt, a jagged, mist-choked expanse of neutral territory where the trees grew thick and the mountain air tasted of ozone and ancient secrets. We walked for hours. Every mile we put between me and the Ironhide border, I felt a layer of leaden fatigue melt away, replaced by a strange, humming clarity. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice finally finding its strength. "To the archives of the earth," Auric replied, not breaking stride. "You think you're a broken Omega, Maristra. You think you're a mistake. But you were never a mistake. You were a battery." We stopped before a sheer rock face covered in thick, centuries-old ivy. Auric placed his palm against the stone, and the cliffside groaned open, revealing a cavern carved not by pickaxes, but by something far more elemental. This was the Shawl Pack's outpost, a fortress of shadows and stone. Inside, the air was warm, smelling of dried sage and old parchment, and sitting by a dying fire, waiting for us, was Kilthorn. He was an elder of the Shawl Pack, his eyes clouded with the wisdom of a man who had seen too many wars. When he saw me, he simply a sound of profound relief. "Maristra," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "I have waited 20 years for this moment. Your mother, Ysara, she carried a secret that would have burned the Ironhide Kingdom to the ground had it ever been spoken aloud." I froze. "My mother was a healer. She kept to the shadows, that's all." "She kept to the shadows to survive, and to protect you," Kilthorn corrected. "She was not a wolf girl, and neither are you." My heart stopped. "What are you talking about? I know I'm no wolf because I can't shift. I am the Omega the king threw away. But what I don't understand is my mother. Are you saying my father married someone he knew was not a wolf? Make me understand. My mother shifted so many times in my presence. I saw her wolf." Kilthorn walked to a heavy wooden chest, pulling out a faded, charcoal-stained map. He traced a line over the mountains. "You were never an Omega. You are an Earth Caller. Your blood is the anchor for this entire land. The sickness you felt your whole life? That wasn't a defect. That was the Ironhide Pack harvesting you." The room seemed to spin. "Harvesting?" "Every time you felt the drain, every time you collapsed after patching a warrior or bolstering the veil, it was the Pack's elite bloodline siphoning your essence," Auric added, his voice low and dangerous. "Your father didn't just ignore you. He tapped into your spirit to amplify his own wolf's strength." "Your mother was a genius of deception," Kilthorn said, his voice grave. She projected a false wolf to keep the suspicion away. That was the only way she was ever able to marry your father. I shook my head, my mind reeling. Are you saying my father knows what I am? I'm confused. My mother made me promise not to tell anyone, not even him. Your father knows everything, Kilthorne said sharply. He is a man of insatiable hunger. He knew exactly what he was using. I slumped back, my brow furrowed in agony. Wait. If my father knows what I am, as you claim, why would he cast me out? If I am his greatest asset, why throw away the very thing that keeps him powerful? Auric stepped forward, his eyes dark with a chilling realization. Because he's a fool, Maristra. He thinks he has matured the veil enough that it no longer needs a host. He believes he has siphoned enough of your essence into the stone and soil of the palace to sustain the shield forever. He discarded you because he thought you were a drained husk, and he wanted to clear the palace of the Omega who no longer served a purpose. Kilthorne nodded. He's a predator who thinks he's a farmer. He thinks he's harvested the crop and no longer needs the earth. I felt the firelight dancing in my eyes, but the heat of it didn't reach my soul. I didn't hold the veil because I was a good daughter. I held it because they were feeding on me. And now? Auric asked, moving closer. Now that the tether is broken? I thought of the king, drinking his wine, unaware that the shield he boasted about was already beginning to scream. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I'm not going to run, I whispered, the words hardening into stone. I'm not going to let them die either. Not yet. What will you do? Kilthorne asked. I'm going to let them feel the hunger, I said, my voice cold. I'm going to let the Shadowmoon clan knock on their front door. And when they finally realize they are nothing without the stain they cast out, then I will decide who survives. Auric smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of the lips. Good, because the rot has already reached the palace gates. They're starting to see the cracks, Maristra, and soon they'll be begging for the ghost they threw away. The days that followed in the Shawl Pack's subterranean fortress were a blur of training and transformation. I had spent 21 years living as a ghost, a hollow vessel that existed only to pour itself into the dirt for the sake of others. Now, Auric was teaching me to stand as a pillar. Every morning he took me to the deepest part of the cavern, where the raw, unrefined magic of the mountain bled through the stone. Stop trying to push the energy away, Auric murmured, standing directly behind me. His voice was a low rumble against the back of my neck. You've spent your life giving until you were empty. That's why you're always cold. You have to learn to circulate it. You aren't a faucet, Maristra. You're the source. He placed his hands over mine, his palms scorching hot against my skin. Don't hold the world together. Command it to stay. I closed my eyes. I reached for the familiar, nagging hunger, the need to feed the veil, but this time I didn't let it leave me. I pulled it back. I curled it around my heart. The result was violent. A searing, silver-white flame erupted from my palms, so bright it burned through my eyelids. It wasn't the sickly, pale glow of the girl who used to bleed in the mud. This was liquid starlight, heavy and molten, pulsing with a rhythm that made the very foundations of the cavern groan. I gasped, my knees buckling, but Auric caught me. He didn't pull away. He braced me, his strength anchoring me as the fire surged through my veins. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was dying. I felt like I was waking up. There, he whispered, his breath hitching as the silver light illuminated the jagged walls of the cave. That is the fire that the Earthcallers use to forge kingdoms, not just mend them. I panted, the light gradually receding into my skin, leaving behind a tingle that felt like electric needles. I turned to look at him, and for the first time, I saw the restraint he had been holding back since the day he found me in the woods. His amber eyes were dark, his jaw tight. He wasn't just my teacher. There was a raw, primal hunger in his gaze that had nothing to do with magic. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the crackling of the nearby torches. "I was a servant, a stain. Everyone else saw me as a mistake. Why did you see something worth saving?" Arik moved closer, the space between us charged with an unbearable tension. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a hesitant, reverent touch. "I saw you at the borders for years, Maristra," he confessed, his voice dropping to a gravelly rasp. "Every time my scouts reported the veil shifting, I'd ride out there. I'd watch you from the tree line, this tiny, fragile thing, pressing your palms into the frost, shivering as you poured your life into that barrier." "You watched me?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You watched me suffer and you didn't help?" "I couldn't," he said, his eyes darkening with a flash of genuine pain. "I knew that if I intervened, if I tried to take you away or offer you a place in my pack, your father would have lost his shield. Your kingdom would have fallen to the Shadowmoon clan years ago. I stayed away because I knew you were the only thing keeping that monster alive, and I didn't want to disrupt your miracle while you were still so fiercely loyal to them." He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine. The scent of pine and mountain air enveloped me, dizzying and intoxicating. "I didn't stay away because I thought you were weak," he continued, his voice so soft I had to lean in to hear him. "I stayed away because I was terrified of what would happen if I touched you. I knew the moment I did, I would burn everything else to the ground just to keep you." The realization hit me harder than the training. The distance he'd kept, the cold, stoic observations during court, it wasn't indifference. It was control. He had been waiting for the exact moment my father's arrogance would finally snap the tether. "You were waiting for me to be discarded," I said, a slow realization blooming in my chest. "I was waiting for you to be free," he corrected. He didn't kiss me, but the intent was there, a palpable force that made the air in the cavern shimmer. He was holding back a storm, and I was the one who had finally opened the door. The slow burn of his gaze, the way his hands lingered on my waist, it was more terrifying than the magic and more addictive than any power I had ever possessed. "The veil is failing, Maristra," he said, pulling back just an inch, his eyes still locked on mine. "Back at the palace, the cold is setting in. The Shadowmoon scouts are already crossing the outer ridges. They can smell the weakness. They can smell the fact that their miracle is finally dying." I looked down at my hands, the faint silver veins glowing beneath my skin. I wasn't just a battery anymore. I was a weapon. And I wasn't afraid of the fire. "Let them come," I whispered. Arik's hand moved from my waist to my hand, interlacing his fingers with mine. His grip was solid, an anchor in the shifting currents of my new reality. "They'll come," he promised, his voice vibrating with a dark, predatory joy. "And when they do, you'll show them exactly what happens when you discard a star." The rot didn't start with a scream. It started with a whisper of frost. In the heart of the Bloodfang Palace, King Alpharon sat upon his high stone throne, a goblet of spiced wine clutched in his hand. For weeks he had been smug. His boarders were silent, his pack was well fed. He believed he had finally shed the stain of his daughter, and in his arrogant mind, he had proven that the veil was a divine gift, autonomous and eternal. Then, the wine in his goblet turned to ice. A crack, sharp as a gunshot, echoed through the high-vaulted ceilings. Alpharon stood, his eyes narrowing as he looked toward the great window overlooking the kingdom. The veil, that shimmering, translucent curtain of protection that had defined our territory for centuries, wasn't just failing, it was splintering. The silver-white light that usually hummed with a protective frequency had turned a bruised, sickly violet. It vibrated violently, sending shockwaves through the stone floors of the palace. "My king!" A guard burst into the throne room, his armor splattered with mud. "The outer patrols! They're reporting the barrier is collapsed! The Shadowmoon scent is everywhere!" Alpharon's face drained of color. "Impossible! The ritual was perfected! The tether was hardened!" He didn't realize that a tether without an anchor is just a rope leading into an abyss. Outside, the chaos was instantaneous. The Shadowmoon clan, those brutal, jagged-toothed nightmares who had lived in the periphery of our hunger for generations, didn't wait. They surged across the border like a black tide. They had been waiting for the exact moment the hum of the earth stopped, the moment the girl they had hunted as a spirit finally went silent. In the lower courtyards, the Ironhide warriors met them with steel, but as the first blades clashed, the unthinkable happened. A warrior named Kale, the man who had mocked me most viciously on the day of my exile, lunged at a Shadowmoon scout. He took a shallow blade to the shoulder, a wound that should have been a mere scratch. In the past, my subconscious healing would have knitted his flesh together before he even hit the ground. But now? Kale let out a choked gurgle. He staggered back, his face turning an ashen gray. The wound didn't heal. It festered. The poison on the Shadowmoon blade burned through him like acid, and he collapsed, his skin turning black with necrosis. "He's not healing!" a medic screamed, scrambling over the blood-slicked stone. "Why isn't he healing? The blood! It's just draining away!" Alpharon stood on the balcony, his knuckles white. He looked for the light. He looked for the silver-white glow that usually mended their broken bodies after every skirmish. There was nothing but the freezing wind and the smell of blood. "Find me the Omega!" Alpharon roared, his voice trembling with a sudden dawning terror. Cast out or not. "Bring her to me!" "She's gone, my king," an elder cried, ducking as a Shadowmoon arrow shattered the stone pillar beside him. "We tracked her to the border, but the trail went cold. She's vanished into the Fenrisar." Alpharon staggered back, his eyes fixed on the encroaching darkness. He finally understood. He looked at his own trembling hands, hands that were beginning to bruise with the same necrotic chill that was killing his men. I thought I had anchored it," he whispered, his voice lost in the cacophony of war. "I thought she was useless to me now, weak and drained. What have I done? I should have waited. I should have waited a little longer, just as I did with her mother. My pack has survived centuries of rain and sun because of her mother's power, which she passed into her. I married that woman only for this power, to produce a replacement in case the first failed. I should have waited." A Shadowmoon warrior, a hulking beast with eyes like burning coals, crashed through the palace doors, splintering the heavy oak. He stopped, sniffing the air, then let out a laugh that chilled the king to the bone. "The girl is gone," the beast growled, his voice echoing in the sudden, terrified silence of the throne room. "And without the host, this land is nothing but a graveyard waiting to be filled." The king collapsed onto his throne, the crown sliding askew on his head. For the first time in his long, brutal reign, Alpharon wasn't an alpha. He was just a man, sitting in the dark, watching the world he had built crumble because of the woman he had thrown away. The Shawlpack's fortress was a sanctuary of stone, but even here the air felt thin and charged with the scent of ozone. I stood by the cliffside entrance, watching the horizon where the Ironhide territory lay. I didn't need a scout to tell me the truth. I could feel the death rattle of the veil. It was a cold, hollow ache in my chest, rhythmic and insistent. "They're falling," I whispered, not looking back as Auric approached. He stopped a few paces behind me, his presence a steady grounding force. "The Shadowmoon clan doesn't take prisoners, Maristra. They take territory, and they burn whatever they find within it." Just as he spoke, a shadow detached itself from the tree line. It was a wolf, or what was left of one. He was limping, his fur matted with dried blood and ash. As he reached the threshold of our stronghold, he shifted into human form, collapsing onto the cold stone floor. It was Kalen, the warrior who had been the first to call me a useless Omega during the banishment. He looked small now, stripped of his arrogance, shivering violently as the necrotic frost crept up his limbs. "Maristra," he wheezed, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and shame. "The palace, it's gone. The king he's hiding in the lower vaults. The Shadowmoon are everywhere. They are butchering everyone." I didn't move. I didn't reach for him. I stood like a statue, the memory of his cold, sneering laughter on the night of my exile echoing in my mind. Kalen crawled forward, his hand clawing at the hem of my tunic. You have to come back. Your father and the seer, they said you're the only one who can stop it. I don't know how, but the healers have nothing left. The warriors are falling like flies. You're our only hope." "Hope?" I repeated, the word tasting like bile. "You called me a stain. You watched as my father tore my life apart. Why should I trade my freedom to save the people who cheered as I was cast into the dark?" Kalen bowed his head, his tears carving clean tracks through the grime on his face. "We didn't know. We thought you were weak. We thought the king had a plan. Please, for the children in the nursery, they didn't do anything to you." The mention of the children stopped my heart. I looked at Auric, expecting him to urge me to let them burn, expecting him to demand revenge for the 20 years of agony I had suffered. Instead, Auric walked over, his face unreadable, and knelt beside me. He didn't look at Kalen. He looked only at me. "This is your choice, Maristra," Auric said, his voice stripped of all command. "I have the power to slaughter the Shadowmoon scouts and retake your father's land, or I can help you fortify this mountain and let the Bloodfang Pack fall. I will not influence you. Whatever you choose, I will stand by you." He stepped back, leaving me alone with the dying man and the crushing weight of my own conscience. I looked at Kalen, a man who had been my tormentor, now reduced to a begging, broken shell. I thought of the palace, of my father's arrogance, and of the innocent lives that would be snuffed out because of a king's hubris. If I saved them, I was the bigger person. But would they ever truly see me as anything other than their battery? If I went back, I would be walking straight back into the cage. "If I go back," I said, my voice echoing off the cavern walls, "I do not go back as a healer. I do not go back as a daughter, and I certainly do not go back as a servant." Auric leaned against the wall, a slight, proud smile touching his lips. "And what do you go back as?" I looked at my hands, the silver light beginning to pulse rhythmically beneath my skin. The fire of the earth caller was no longer a flicker, it was a storm, and for the first time, I felt ready to let it break. "I go back," I said, "as the queen of the earth." The choice is made. She isn't going back to serve, she is going back to conquer. The walk back to the Ironhide Palace was not a journey, it was a reckoning. As we approached the border, the devastation was absolute. The forest, once lush and whispering with the secrets of the earth, was now a scorched, silent wasteland. The shadow of the Shadowmoon clan hung over the land like a shroud, their scent, thick with sulfur and rot, clinging to the very air. Kalen stumbled beside me, his strength fading with every step, his eyes wide as he saw the destruction of the kingdom he had once served with blind devotion. When we finally broke through the tree line, the palace came into view. It was a ruin. The great obsidian gates were shattered, torn from their hinges by monstrous strength. Smoke curled from the high parapets, and the screams of the dying drifted on the wind. I stopped at the edge of the courtyard. Auric fell in behind me, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade, his presence a silent promise of violence. "They're inside the keep," Kalen gasped, falling to his knees. "The king is trapped in the vault. He's praying for a miracle." "He isn't getting a miracle," I said, my voice cold, calm, and utterly devoid of the fear that had once defined me. "He is getting the harvest." I took a step forward, and the earth responded. It wasn't a subtle shift. The ground beneath my feet hummed, a deep, resonant vibration that shattered the stone walkway. I didn't reach for the light this time. I invited it home. The silver fire erupted from my skin, not as a flickering candle, but as a torrential flood. It swirled around me, forming a crown of searing white light that turned the darkness of the evening into blinding noon. The Shadowmoon warriors guarding the gates turned, their snarls dying in their throats. They saw me, the girl they had disregarded as a broken omega, and they recoiled. They sensed the shift in the balance. The ground they stood on was no longer theirs, it was mine. I didn't run. I walked. And with every step, the silver light wove through the air, binding the very shadows of the courtyard to my will. "Leave," I commanded. It wasn't a request, it was an edict of the earth itself. The Shadowmoon scouts hesitated, but when I gestured, the ground beneath them erupted in shards of granite and pulsing, silver-veined earth. They were thrown back like dolls, their weapons twisting into useless scrap metal. I reached the palace doors and pushed. They didn't need to be pried open, they simply dissolved into dust, unable to withstand the pressure of my presence. I strode into the great hall. The air was frigid, filled with the stench of decay. My father, King Alpharon, sat slumped against the base of his throne. He looked ancient, his hair gone white, his skin etched with the gray rot of the Shadowmoon poison. He looked up, his eyes glassy and unfocused, until they landed on me. For a heartbeat, there was silence. "Maristra?" he breathed, his voice a jagged whisper. He looked past me, his eyes widening as he saw the blazing crown of light hovering above my head. You were supposed to be disposable?" I finished, stepping into the light of the inner hall. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a profound, terrifying pity. He was a man who had sold his soul for a kingdom that was now nothing more than ash. "You wanted to harvest the earth, Father," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "But you forgot the most important rule of the soil." I raised my hand, and the silver flame intensified, turning the entire hall into a cathedral of starlight. "The earth doesn't belong to the one who tills it," I said, the floor trembling as I walked toward him. "It belongs to the one who owns the roots." I stood before him, the queen of the earth, and watched the last remnants of his arrogance crumble into dust. Alpharon's breath hitched, a wet, rattling sound that lacked any trace of the Alpha's command he had once wielded like a hammer. He clawed at the stone of his throne, trying to stand, but his legs, ravaged by the necrotic curse of the Shadowmoon blade, would not hold his weight. "Maristra," he gasped, his voice trembling as the silver light of my crown flickered against the cold, dead walls of the throne room. I did what I had to. The pack, it required the strength of the Earth Caller. It was for the greater good." I didn't answer with words. I merely tapped my boot against the floor, and the stone beneath him groaned, splintering into fine, white dust. The throne itself, the seat of his greed, began to tilt, the architecture of the palace recognizing a new master. You speak of the greater good while you harvested the life of your own child, I said, my voice echoing with a resonance that shook the tapestries from the walls. You treated me as a battery to be drained until dry. But batteries eventually run out. The earth, Father, the earth remembers everything. I gestured, and the silver roots of my power snaked out from the floor, binding his wrists to the armrests of his throne. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a prisoner of his own foundation. What are you doing? He choked out, terror finally overriding his pride. I am showing you the truth, I said, stepping closer. I looked past him to the great hall where the survivors of the Bloodfang Pack were gathering. They were broken, bloodied, and cowering. They looked at me not with hatred, but with a primal, soul-deep dread. I turned to them, my voice projecting across the entire chamber. Look at your alpha. Look at the man who built his empire on the silent suffering of an Omega. He didn't lead you with strength. He led you with a parasite's hunger. The silence in the hall was absolute, save for the crackle of the silver flame that wove between the pillars. The Shadowmoon clan is fleeing, I announced, my eyes sweeping over the cowering pack. They fear the ground they stand on because the earth itself has turned against them. Your king thought he had tamed the land. He was wrong. He never owned it. He was only ever a tenant. I turned back to Alpharon. You will live, Father. You will live long enough to watch me tear down every lie you built. You will live to see a pack where strength is earned through blood and sweat, not stolen from a child. I flicked my wrist, and the silver light surged, cleansing the necrotic rot from the air, but leaving the king's broken body exactly as it was, a testament to his failure. Guards! I barked. The warriors who had once enforced his laws looked at me, then at their ruined king. They didn't reach for their blades. They fell to their knees. A collective gasp moved through the room, a sound of surrender. He is no longer your alpha, I declared, my voice echoing like a final judgment. And I am no longer your Omega. I walked toward the throne, the silver crown above my head burning with a steady, untouchable intensity. Arik stood at the threshold, watching me with that same dangerous, respectful hunger. He didn't bow. He stepped aside, the only one in the room who stood tall in the presence of the new queen. I sat on the throne, the cold stone warming instantly under my touch, surging with the heartbeat of the land. The harvest is over, I said, looking out over the kneeling pack. From this day forward, the earth feeds those who honor it, and those who seek to bleed it will find that it has no more to give. Alpharon let out a broken sob, his head dropping to his chest. The Bloodfang Pack, the mighty warriors of the north, were now mine to command. But as I looked at my hands, I didn't see a girl who had finally gotten revenge. I saw a queen who had inherited a graveyard. I had the throne, the power, and the pack. Now, I had to decide if I was willing to be the ruler this land deserved, or if I would become the monster I had just replaced. 6 months had passed since the night the palace walls bled silver light and the iron-hide reign of terror crumbled. The reconstruction was grueling. I hadn't just been rebuilding walls. I had been rewriting the spirit of the Bloodfang Pack. I had stripped away the hierarchical cruelty of my father's rule and replaced it with a system rooted in the earth itself. Every warrior, every healer, and every child now understood that their strength came from the land, and that the land answered only to me. My father sat in the corner of the garden, a hollowed-out man, watching with glassy eyes as I walked the grounds. He was alive, a living monument to his own hubris, but he held no power. The pack had forgotten his name. They whispered mine with a mixture of reverence and fear. I had just finished anchoring the final ley line in the northern quadrant when the heavy iron gates of the palace groaned open. A procession entered. It was the Shawl Pack, led by Calethorn. He moved with the steady, measured gait of an elder who knew exactly what he was carrying. And beside him, walking with the grace of a predator and the confidence of an equal, was Auric. He wore his formal furs, the color of twilight, his amber eyes locked on me from the moment he stepped into the courtyard. I met them halfway, the silver light of my authority humming beneath my skin. I didn't need to ask why they were here. The air between us was thick with a new kind of tension, not the cold, sharp edge of war, but the heavy, intoxicating pull of something inevitable. Calethorn bowed, his head dipping low. It was a gesture of deep respect, one that bridged the gap between our two houses. "Queen Maristhra," Calethorn said, his voice resonant. "We come not as allies, but as suitors. The mountains have whispered of a union that would stabilize the earth for generations. The Shawl and the Bloodfang have spent centuries watching each other's borders. It is time the borders vanished." He stepped back, leaving Auric standing alone before me. Auric stopped inches away. He didn't bow. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers calloused and warm, contrasting with the cool, shimmering energy that always radiated from my palms. He looked at me, and for a moment, the fearsome commander of the Shawl Pack vanished, replaced by the man who had watched me in the frost for years, waiting for me to be free. "I didn't come to win a war today," Auric said, his voice dropping to that low, rhythmic vibration that made my pulse jump. "I came to claim the only thing in this world that is worth the fire." He knelt. The entire courtyard went deathly silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He pulled a small, circular band from his tunic. It wasn't made of gold or silver. It was forged from the dark, indestructible ore of the Grey Belt, inlaid with a single, pulsing fragment of the Earth's own heart. "You spent your life being a sacrifice," Auric said, his eyes burning into mine. "You spent your soul protecting people who didn't deserve your pulse. Marry me, Maristhra, not to bind our packs, not to cement the peace, and not to make you a queen. I know you are already the most powerful being on this earth. I want to stand beside you while you rule it." He looked up, his expression stripped of all pretense. "I don't want your power, and I don't want your duty. I want your heart. Will you be my wife?" I looked at the ring, then at Auric. I saw the man who had been my anchor when I was drowning, the man who had respected my choice even when it meant risking his own life to defend my test of mercy. I reached down, taking his hand to pull him up. As he stood, I pressed my forehead against his. The connection was electric, a fusion of my earth magic and his primal strength. "I spent my life being a battery for others," I whispered, so only he could hear. "With you, I don't have to be a source of energy for anyone else. I can just be me." I held out my hand, and as he slid the band onto my finger, a shockwave of light pulsed outward from our joined hands, rippling across the entire valley. The grass turned emerald, the flowers bloomed in the dead of winter, and the very earth seemed to sing in approval. The Bloodfang Pack and the Shawl Pack, once ancient rivals, erupted into a roar of celebration. Auric pulled me into his arms, his hold firm and possessive. I wasn't just the queen of the earth anymore. I was a woman who had finally chosen her own destiny, and the man who would walk the path of fire by my side. The ceremony was not held in the grand, hollowed-out vaults of the palace, but beneath the open sky, at the exact center of the border that had once divided the Bloodfang and the Shawl. The air was crisp, scented with the pine of the north and the rich, waking earth of a land finally at peace. Thousands of wolves, warriors who had once bared their teeth at one another in the dark, now stood shoulder to shoulder in the tall, swaying grass. I stood at the altar of raw stone, dressed in a gown of woven moonlight and mountain silver. Beside me stood Auric. He did not look like the predator who had once watched me from the shadows. He looked like a man who had finally come home. When Calethorn stepped forward to perform the binding, the silence of the forest was absolute. He didn't speak of submission or of blood oaths. He spoke of the balance between the sky and the soil. "By the law of the earth and the heart," Calethorn intoned, his voice carrying over the silent thousands, "we bind these two souls, not as masters, but as anchors." He held out two crowns, not of gold, which tarnishes, but of ironwood and silver ore, intricately entwined with living, pulsing vines. Auric reached for one, his eyes never leaving mine. With a steady hand, he placed the crown upon my head. As the ironwood touched my brow, the earth beneath us surged. A ripple of emerald energy raced through the crowd, turning the very air into a conduit of life. I reached for the second crown. I placed it upon Auric's head. In that moment, a blinding, gold-and-silver light erupted from the center of our union. It didn't just illuminate the clearing, it wove into the veins of every wolf present. The hostility that had festered between the Bloodfang and the Shawl for generations dissolved, replaced by a deep, resonant hum of belonging. "I name you king," I whispered, the power of the land surging through my voice until it sounded like the thunder of 1,000 mountains. "I name you queen," Auric replied, his voice equally steady, resonating with the strength of a true alpha. We turned to face the people. They didn't kneel out of the cold, mechanical obligation they had once shown my father. They stood, their eyes glowing with a newfound, fierce loyalty. The two packs were no longer rivals. They were a single, unstoppable force, the Iron Shawl Union. I looked at Auric, then out over the horizon. My father was long gone, banished to the very servants' quarters he had once forced me to inhabit, a quiet man living in the shadow of the queen he had failed to understand. I reached for Auric's hand, and his fingers interlocked with mine, firm and unbreakable. We were not just rulers, we were the heartbeat of this land. We had ended the harvest. We had ended the hunger. And as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting a long, beautiful shadow over the kingdom we had built from the ashes, I knew one thing for certain. The earth was finally ours to protect. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just surviving, I was reigning. The peace we had forged in the shadow of our crowns lasted exactly one cycle of the moon. It was a fragile thing, born of new laws and shared bread, but the old world still clung to its jagged teeth. The Shadowmoon clan did not come in the night as they had before. They did not creep through the undergrowth like thieves. They came at midday, a torrential, living wave of black fur, rusted steel, and raw, starving malice. They were driven by a desperation that defied logic, a hunger that had been denied for months, a void in their bellies that only the harvest of a kingdom could fill. They threw their entire weight against the northern borders of our united kingdom, expecting the old Bloodfang. They expected a crumbling, neglected shield and a frantic, failing king. They expected us to bleed. Auric and I stood atop the highest, most desolate ridge of the Grey Belt, the two crowns upon our brows glowing with a synchronized, rhythmic pulse that hummed against our skin like the heartbeat of the world itself. Below us, the tree line buckled. Thousands of Shadowmoon warriors surged forward, their howls tearing through the sky like jagged glass, a sound that usually sent the very birds fleeing for their lives. But as they hit the outer perimeter of our land, they didn't meet steel. They didn't meet resistance. They met the earth itself. "They want the hunger," I said, my voice projecting across the battlefield, loud as a landslide, resonant as the deep, grinding plates of the mountain. Give it to them. Let them see what happens when the land no longer answers to shadows. I slammed my palms into the ancient, sun-baked mountain stone. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The ground beneath the Shadowmoon army turned to liquid silver. Roots as thick as palace pillars erupted from the loam, twisting like starving serpents, ensnaring their vanguard and lifting them into the air. The earth did not merely hold them, it consumed their footing. The soil turned to quicksand, pulling their heavy, plated boots down into the deep, dark loam until they were anchored in the dirt they had spent their lives desecrating. Beside me, Auric took flight. He leaped from the ridge, shifting mid-air into a wolf of monumental size, a beast of nightmare, his fur the color of bruised storm clouds, his eyes burning with the golden, unyielding light of a true king. He hit the center of the Shadowmoon line like a falling star. The impact alone sent a shockwave of dust and displaced air that flattened the front rank. Auric was a blur of violence and precision, his claws carving through their defenses not with the chaotic rage of a beast, but with the measured, lethal intent of a ruler protecting his home. The battle was not a skirmish. It was a total, absolute reclamation. I didn't stay on the ridge. I descended, walking through the carnage as if it were a garden in mid-bloom. Everywhere I stepped, the earth rose to shield our warriors and disarm the invaders. If a Shadowmoon scout drew a blade, the stone beneath his feet would shatter, forcing him off balance. If they fired a volley of arrows, the earth would swell into a mound of solid granite, catching the iron in the rock before it could find a target. The Shadowmoon Alpha, a hulking, scarred beast with eyes like burning, coal-filled pits, spotted me. He broke away from the fray, lunging with a snarl that sprayed frothing gore. He was a creature of pure malice, a survivor of the old world who refused to die. Auric was there in a heartbeat, intercepting him. The two alphas collided, a blur of fur and fangs, but Auric wasn't just fighting for territory. He was fighting for the queen who had taught him that power was not about the kill, but about the preservation of the soil. With a final, crushing blow that echoed like a mountain collapsing, Auric forced the Shadowmoon Alpha to his knees. I stood before the defeated monster, the silver light radiating from my hands until it was almost blinding. "Your hunger ends today," I told him, the entire battlefield falling into a terrified, breathless silence. "You have spent centuries leeching off the edges of our land because you had no roots of your own. You are a starving dog at a feast you refuse to join. You have spent your history stealing, while we have spent ours growing." I reached out, placing my hand upon the Alpha's heaving, matted chest. I didn't kill him. I did something much worse for his pride. I stripped the darkness from his blood. I poured the crushing, heavy vitality of the earth into his veins, forcing his body to reconcile with the life he had spent centuries destroying. It was a baptism of reality. He collapsed, shaking violently, his predatory edge dulled by the sudden, overwhelming, and agonizing connection to the soil he had walked upon but never felt. "You have a choice," I declared, my voice resonating through the minds of every Shadowmoon warrior on the field. "You can die here, clutching your shadows, or you can kneel. The earth has no room for your hunger, but it has plenty of room for your service. We are no longer packs divided by blood or bite. We are a single, rooted nation." One by one, the Shadowmoon warriors dropped their weapons. They fell to their knees, their dark, terrified eyes wide as they felt the hum of the land for the first time, a sensation they had been denied for an eternity. They didn't just surrender, they belonged. By sunset, the battlefield was quiet. The stench of ozone and rot had been replaced by the sweet, damp smell of turned earth. The Shadowmoon clan, once the scourge of the mountains, was no longer a threat. They were a new branch of our kingdom, bound to the same roots that fed the Bloodfang and the Shawl. Auric shifted back to human form, his skin stained with the dust of victory and the sweat of his labor. He walked to me, his heavy, steady breathing the only sound in the sudden calm. He pulled me into his arms, and I rested my head against his chest, feeling the beat of a heart that was now perfectly aligned with mine. We stood on the battlefield that had once been a symbol of our division, now the heart of an empire. The Bloodfang, the Shawl, and the Shadowmoon. 3 packs, 1 crown, and 1 queen. I looked up at Auric, the weight of the total victory resting on our shoulders, feeling the deep, unbreakable connection to the dirt beneath our boots. "We are complete now," I whispered, the words carrying into the cool evening air. Auric kissed my brow, his touch gentle despite the blood on his hands and the intensity in his eyes. "We are not just complete, Maristra. We are eternal." I looked out over the vast, shimmering expanse of my kingdom, feeling every root, every stone, and every heartbeat of my people. The harvest was truly over. The era of the parasitic kings had died with my father, and the age of the Earthcaller had finally, truly begun. The seasons in the northern reach no longer cycled by the whims of cold winds or the desperation of survival. They cycled by the heartbeat of the land, and the land was at peace. It had been 10 years since the shadow of the Shadowmoon was folded into the soil of our kingdom. The scars of the old wars were buried deep beneath layers of silver-veined stone and flourishing forests. Yet, in the quiet of the high keep, a different kind of silence lingered. I stood on the balcony, the stone cool beneath my bare feet. Below, the courtyards were filled with the laughter of children, the children of the united tribes, their skin and fur glowing with the faint, steady pulse of the earth magic I had shared with them. They were the future, the heirs to a world that no longer demanded a harvest of blood. Auric appeared behind me, his arms sliding around my waist, his chin resting on my shoulder. His hair was touched with a few silver strands, but his amber eyes burned with the same intensity as the day he found me in the briars of the Fenrizar. "They're blooming," he murmured, nodding toward the lower gardens, where the star blossoms turned their iridescent silver heads to follow our movement. I followed his gaze, but my heart felt a strange, familiar tug, not of sorrow, but of profound reflection. In our 10 years of ruling, we had healed a kingdom, unified 3 warring packs, and turned a graveyard into a garden. We had given our people everything, yet our own hearth remained quiet. "The pack wonders," I said softly, my voice barely a whisper. "They see us together, they see the stability we've built, and they wait for an heir to inherit the crown of the Earthcaller." Auric turned me in his arms, his expression uncharacteristically somber. He didn't look at the kingdom, he looked only at me. "Let them wonder," he said, his voice dropping to that low, grounding rumble. "I didn't marry you to secure a lineage, Maristra. I married you because you were the only one who truly understood the cost of a soul. If the land decides we are the end of our line, then we are the end of our line. We have given this world more than any king or queen before us." I leaned into him, feeling the steady thrum of his heartbeat, the heartbeat of a man who had chosen to serve the land rather than consume it. "I spent 21 years as a vessel," I admitted, my hand tracing the line of his jaw. "Perhaps the earth is simply protecting me from the memory of that. Perhaps it knows that I have already poured enough of myself into this world to last 1,000 lifetimes. Or perhaps," Auric whispered, pressing his forehead against mine, "it is simply waiting for a different kind of creation. We have built an empire of peace. That is a child of its own." I looked out toward the ancient, massive heart tree that stood at the center of the palace grounds, its roots spanning the entirety of the territory. It was the physical anchor of our power, a monument to the end of the harvest. It didn't need a sapling to grow. It only needed the ground to be rich and the sky to be clear. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, there was no weight on my lungs. There was no tether. There was only the earth, firm and unwavering beneath my feet, and the man beside me who had watched, waited, and finally helped me turn the world into a garden. "We are the anchors," I said, a smile touching my lips. And that is enough. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine, rain, and the sweet, rich promise of a future that would never again be traded for strength. We stood there, the king and queen of a realm that needed no biological heir to define its glory, because we had become the very soul of the soil itself. The era of the harvest was long dead. The era of the queen had just begun, and it would be ours, and ours alone, to define. The end. We have reached the end of the road for Maristra and Arik, a journey that started in the freezing mud of an exile's camp and ended on the throne of a united kingdom. When I first set out to write this, I was obsessed with a single, sharp thought. What if the person deemed useless is actually the foundation holding the world together? Maristra's story wasn't meant to be just another fairy tale about wolves and war. It was a mirror for anyone who has ever been told they are too quiet, too broken, or not enough. We have all lived through moments where the people around us failed to see our value, trying to harvest our energy rather than respect our humanity. Writing Maristra was my way of taking back that narrative. I wanted to show that the things that make you different or defective are often the very things that give you the power to shatter the systems designed to keep you small. My greatest hope is that this series served as a reminder of your own worth. Whether you are currently in your exile phase or sitting on your own hard-won throne, know that your voice has an incredible, undeniable frequency. You don't need a crown to have power. You just need to stop letting others define your worth. I want to hear from you. Every single comment matters to me. What was the moment that truly got you? Was it the first time Maristra realized the rot in her father's heart? Or was it the moment she walked into the palace as a queen rather than a victim? Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from. I am endlessly fascinated to see how far this story has traveled across the map. To my longtime subscribers, thank you for being the foundation of this channel. Your engagement is the fuel that keeps these stories burning. And to those who are joining now, welcome to the pack. There is a seat for every single one of you. You guys are my backbone. We are targeting more than 2,000 subscribers, and with a pack this fierce, I know we can get there. If you enjoy stories about werewolf romance, Luna story, and romance that can move mountains, please hit that subscribe button. It is the single biggest way to help this community grow and reach more people who need to hear a story about standing tall. Thank you for trusting me with your time and for being part of this story.